Every energy crisis looks different on the surface. An oil embargo in 1973, price spikes in 2008, pipelines sabotaged in 2022. Yet each catastrophe follows the same seven-stage pattern hidden beneath decades of progress and political promises. Today, 40% of Europe's energy still hinges on a single supplier, and global infrastructure is stretched to its thinnest margin in history. If the math holds, the next stage will hit harder and sooner than anyone expects. But why do we keep falling for the same trap, and can we escape it before 2026? After World War II, cities and suburbs stretched outward in every direction. Asphalt highways unfurled across farmland, connecting new homes, shopping centers, and factories that ran day and night. The rhythm of daily life, commuting, manufacturing, even the delivery of groceries, was built on the promise that energy, especially oil, would always be cheap and abundant. Urban planners mapped out neighborhoods with wide boulevards and distant driveways, never doubting that gasoline would flow freely. Car ownership soared, and with it, the design of entire communities shifted toward long commutes and sprawling developments. Inside factories, production lines ran on just-in-time principles. Warehouses shrank, inventory costs dropped, and goods flowed smoothly from distant ports to local shelves. The system rewarded speed and efficiency, not backup plans. Every link in the supply chain depended on fuel arriving exactly when needed. If a shipment was delayed, there was no cushion, only empty shelves and halted assembly lines. By the 2000s, globalization wove these patterns even tighter. Products crossed continents in containers, their journeys timed to the hour. The assumption was simple: energy would always be available and disruptions were unthinkable. In Europe, industries and power plants were modernized around a steady stream of affordable Russian gas, locking in a single source for nearly half the continent's needs. Few questioned these choices. Economic models treated cheap energy as a given, not a variable. Infrastructure spending followed the same logic, with little thought for redundancy or resilience. A former European commissioner once summed up the mindset: when you're planning for 30 years, you don't imagine the fuel will ever stop. This collective confidence became a blind spot. As memories of past shortages faded, so did the drive to invest in alternatives or prepare for scarcity. The entire system, homes, factories, farms, and supply chains, became optimized for abundance. Underneath the surface, the seeds of fragility were quietly taking root. A single supplier quietly became the backbone of Europe's energy system. By the late 2010s, nearly 40% of the continent's natural gas imports came from Russia, delivered through a web of pipelines stretching from Siberia to Western capitals. This concentration was not unique to gas or to Europe. In the 1970s, the United States and Western Europe drew most of their oil from a handful of OPEC countries. In the 2000s, the world's oil supply depended on just a few major exporters, each vulnerable to political or technical disruption. The pattern repeated across decades. Dependency narrowed, but confidence grew. Behind the scenes, the system's real buffer, the ability to withstand shocks, grew thinner. Transmission system operators responsible for keeping the lights on tracked reserve margins shrinking year after year. Reports from ENTSO-E, the European Network of Transmission System Operators, warned that safety margins on the grid were at historic lows during peak demand. Deferred maintenance on aging infrastructure became routine as budgets prioritized efficiency over resilience. When supply ran smoothly, these vulnerabilities stayed hidden. When demand surged or a pipeline faltered, there was little slack to absorb the blow. Storage, the last line of defense, offered limited protection. In the early 2020s, European gas storage capacity covered only a fraction of annual consumption, enough for weeks, not months. Investment in new storage lagged far behind the growth in energy demand. Strategic reserves once built as insurance against crisis were drawn down or neglected. The logic was simple: why pay to store what always seemed to arrive on time? System operators warned that dependency on a single supplier, combined with minimal storage and thinning reserve margins, created a fragile equilibrium. As long as flows stayed steady, the illusion of strength held. But the technical data told a different story, one of rising risk hidden in plain sight waiting for a trigger. On October 19, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an embargo on oil shipments to the United States and several European allies. The decision came less than 2 weeks after the Yom Kippur War began in the Middle East. Tankers bound for Western ports were turned away, and global oil markets scrambled to find replacement barrels. Within days, crude oil prices began a rapid climb, shaking the foundations of economies that had never known true scarcity. The embargo did not just limit supply, it shattered the illusion that energy would always be available on demand. 3 decades later, a different spark hit an equally fragile system. In July 2008, the price of oil reached $147 a barrel, the highest on record. This was not the result of a single war or embargo, but a collision of surging global demand, dwindling spare production capacity, and financial speculation pouring into commodity markets. Traders watched as futures contracts soared, sometimes detached from the physical realities of supply and demand. One veteran trader said that when the market gets tight, psychology takes over, and that it was not just barrels anymore, but fear. In 2022, the fuse was lit not by embargo or market frenzy, but by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Almost overnight, Europe's flow of Russian natural gas, nearly 40% of its supply, was throttled by sanctions, countermeasures, and sabotage. The Nord Stream pipeline, a critical artery for German industry, was first slowed and then shut down entirely. Gas prices at the Dutch TTF hub shot from €30 per megawatt hour to nearly €340 per megawatt hour in 7 months, a jump that rippled through electricity, manufacturing, and food production. The shockwaves did not stop at pipelines or power plants. Each crisis had its own unique trigger, but the outcome was always the same: a tightly wound system, hit by a single spark, setting off a chain reaction that no one could quickly control. When energy supply tightens and spare capacity falls to zero, price signals stop behaving in a linear, predictable way. Markets lurch into a new regime where every extra molecule or barrel commands an outsized premium. The spot price is not set by the average cost of production, but by the cost of the very last unit needed to keep the lights on or the factory running. In these moments, the marginal cost curve turns almost vertical. A 2% shortfall in supply does not mean a 2% price rise. It can mean a 200% or 2,000% surge, depending on how close the system is to the edge. This is the world of runaway pricing mechanics. The term backwardation becomes shorthand for stress. When near-term prices soar above future contracts, it is a signal that buyers are desperate for immediate delivery. Holding physical inventory becomes more profitable than selling it forward, so traders and utilities draw down storage at record speed. That drains the buffer that might have softened the blow, making each day's shortage worse than the last. Liquidity, the ability to buy or sell without moving the price, evaporates as volatility explodes. Market makers widen their spreads or step back entirely. For energy traders, a sudden price spike can trigger margin calls, demands for cash collateral to cover losses on futures positions. When these calls hit, even the biggest utilities and trading houses scramble to raise billions overnight. Some are forced to sell assets at fire sale prices, amplifying the original shock. In 2022, European gas and power markets saw margin requirements multiply tenfold in a matter of weeks, pushing even well-capitalized firms to the brink. Speculation intensifies the feedback loop. As prices climb, investors pile in, betting on further gains. Index funds and algorithmic traders add momentum, buying futures and options in volumes that dwarf the underlying physical trade. The result is a self-reinforcing spiral. Physical scarcity drives prices up, financial flows chase the trend, and the cost of energy detaches from the fundamentals of supply and demand. At the core, the market is sending a blunt message. There simply is not enough supply to meet demand at any reasonable price. When spare capacity is gone and storage is emptying fast, the system has no cushion left. The price explosion is not just a number, it is a signal that scarcity has become absolute. The next phase will be shaped by political intervention, not market mechanics. Governments reached for their fiscal toolkits as prices surged, deploying emergency measures on a scale not seen in decades. Across Europe, more than 500 billion euros were committed to shield households and businesses from runaway energy costs. Subsidies flowed directly to utility bills, and price caps were imposed on electricity and gas. Windfall taxes targeted the profits of energy producers. Strategic reserves, built up over years as a buffer against crisis, were tapped and sold into the market, draining inventories that had once been seen as untouchable. In Germany, the government released more than 15 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserves, while similar actions played out in France, Italy, and the UK. These interventions provided immediate relief, but they came with a hidden cost. By capping prices and subsidizing consumption, policymakers dulled the price signals that would have encouraged conservation and new investment in supply. Energy producers faced uncertainty over future returns, discouraging them from expanding capacity just when it was most needed. Investors, watching governments intervene in market pricing, grew wary of committing capital to long-term infrastructure. An IMF analyst described the situation as a fiscal balancing act, public money flowing out at record speed to cushion voters, even as the underlying system remained fragile. Emergency imports were purchased at any price, pushing up global costs and straining public budgets. The ledger showed a stark reality: billions spent to buy time, but little to fix the core vulnerabilities. The next phase would not be shaped by policy announcements, but by the consequences of these choices. When energy prices leap beyond reach, the damage spreads far beyond balance sheets. In late 2022, the Yara Ferrara ammonia plant in northern Italy announced a full shutdown. The CEO's statement was blunt. With natural gas prices at 10 times their previous level, every ton produced meant a bigger loss. The plant's closure rippled outward. Local farmers faced fertilizer shortages, and suppliers scrambled for alternatives. One manager described the decision as a last resort, not just for the company, but for the entire region's food supply chain. Across the continent, similar stories unfolded. Aluminum smelters in Slovakia powered down, unable to pay electricity bills that now rivaled payroll. Chemical manufacturers in Germany cut shifts or moved production abroad. In Poland, glassmakers and ceramics factories idled kilns that had burned for generations. Each closure was not just a line on a spreadsheet. It meant lost jobs, broken routines, and uncertainty for thousands of families. Inside homes, the crisis played out in quieter ways. An NGO in Hungary reported that by January 2023, 1 in 5 households it surveyed had skipped meals to pay winter heating bills. Parents bundled children in extra layers, rationed hot water, and watched as grocery prices climbed alongside energy bills. In Madrid and Paris, crowds gathered outside government offices, holding signs demanding relief from impossible choices. Protests erupted in Prague and London, fueled by anger over soaring rents and shrinking paychecks. The crisis was no longer abstract. It had become a daily negotiation between warmth and hunger, between work and survival. For many, the old certainty that the system would provide had vanished, replaced by a sense of exposure and fragility. After every energy crisis, governments and markets scrambled to design a new system that promises to be stronger than the last. In the late 1970s, oil shocks pushed Western nations to invest in North Sea drilling, expand nuclear power, and enforce fuel efficiency standards. These moves reduced dependence on OPEC, but they also locked economies into new supply chains and technologies that carried their own risks. The reset solved one problem and created new ones. The 2008 crisis brought a different kind of reset. High prices and financial turmoil triggered the U.S. shale boom, turning America from the world's largest oil importer into a leading exporter within a decade. The shale revolution flooded markets with new supply, but it depended on continuous drilling and easy financing. Those conditions proved fragile whenever prices fell or credit tightened. After the 2022 shock, Europe rushed to replace Russian gas with liquefied natural gas from the US, Qatar, and Australia. In a single year, the continent added more than 50 billion cubic meters of new LNG import capacity, a build-out that would have seemed unthinkable before the crisis. At the same time, governments accelerated renewable energy targets, pouring billions into wind, solar, and grid upgrades. Nuclear power, once sidelined, returned to policy discussions in France, the UK, and even Germany. But each reset creates new fault lines. LNG imports now tie Europe's energy security to a handful of export hubs and a global fleet of tankers that are vulnerable to bottlenecks. Renewables, while cleaner, depend on weather and require vast investment in storage and transmission. Shale, for all its scale, faces steep decline rates and mounting environmental scrutiny. As the International Energy Agency's senior analysts warn, every transition solves one set of dependencies while planting the seeds for the next. Some countries adapt quickly and gain an edge. Others lag behind and pay a lasting price. The winners and losers shift, but the underlying pattern of risk remains. In 2025, every warning light on the energy dashboard is flashing red. Global spare production capacity hovers near historic lows, while investment in new oil, gas, and grid infrastructure continues to lag far behind projected demand. The International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund have both issued joint statements warning that the world's energy system is entering a period of heightened risk, where even a minor disruption could unleash a crisis on the scale of 1973 or 2022. Power grids across Europe and North America are operating with reserve margins so thin that a single extreme weather event or technical fault could trigger rolling blackouts. Strategic reserves, once considered a backstop, remain partially depleted after recent emergency releases. LNG import terminals in Europe are running close to capacity, and new projects are years from completion. Geopolitical tensions are stacked at every major choke point. The Strait of Hormuz, through which over 20% of global oil flows, faces the threat of closure if conflict with Iran escalates. In East Asia, any flare-up over Taiwan could disrupt critical energy and semiconductor supply chains. Cyber attacks on grid infrastructure, once a theoretical risk, have become a weekly reality for system operators. Even a severe drought in a region dependent on hydropower could set off a cascade, as happened in Norway and China in recent years. The system's fragility is not a secret. Analysts at the International Energy Agency point to the mathematics: when spare capacity drops below 2%, the probability of a cascading failure grows exponentially. Research at the International Monetary Fund highlights the feedback loop: underinvestment, aging assets, and geopolitical stress combine to make the global energy network less resilient than at any point in the last 2 decades. In this environment, a 5% supply disruption, whether from sabotage, sanctions, or natural disaster, would not be absorbed. Prices would spike, storage would drain, and governments would scramble for solutions with little time to act. The risk is not hypothetical. It is the sum of every deferred upgrade, every postponed investment, every assumption that the next crisis is years away. Right now, global energy systems remain primed for disruption. Over 60% of new power investment still relies on fossil fuels or single-source imports. The next shock is not a question of if, but when. Resilience demands more than hope or headlines. It requires investment before crisis, not after. History's pattern holds until we choose to break it. What would it take to finally learn before the lesson costs everything?